Summer youth series, and I think the theme was like standing on the promises or stand up for Christ or something like that. It was at Lake Dallas. Some of you might remember it, but he did legitimately have us stand for half of his lesson, and I thought it was a joke until about 25 minutes in, and I realized, oh, this is on purpose. We're actually going to stand this entire time. It was pretty funny. Tonight, officially, I am a guest speaker who is here to begin our summer series. That's how this works. We're starting off our summer series, and I think it's already been mentioned a couple times, but we got a flyer in the back, a much larger flyer than normal, but a flyer nonetheless. It has got a lion and a lamb, and our theme is divine dichotomy. So this summer, on Sunday nights, we've got, I'm not going to count them, somewhere near 14 guest speakers lined up to come and preach on this topic of divine dichotomy. They each got to pick a subtopic for that, and this flyer has all the speakers' names, all the dates, and all of the topics that are going to be discussed. A couple that I think are really exciting. Next week, when a complaint isn't a complaint. The week after that, God's peaceful sword. Okay. Jeremy Beller will do sovereign but jealous. A lot of these are going to be really, really fun to learn about and learn a little bit about who our God is. The idea behind our theme is that our God is not often one or the other, but both wrapped into one. He is not, to use some of the examples here, he is not only sovereign, meaning everything that he wills happens, and he is not only jealous, meaning he doesn't like when things don't go his way, but he is both of those at the same time. Tonight, we're talking about physical and spiritual. This is a topic that I have realized I've been chewing on for, 8 years or something like that. It's just been in the back of my mind. I've been bringing it up little by little. You know how a cow eats? That's about what I've been doing with this topic of physical and spiritual. And I think this is one of those divine dichotomies. We're talking about the relationship between these two. And so in order to really get a good handle on what that looks like, I think one of the things we need to do is ask, how do we normally think about the physical and the spiritual? What do we normally say about that? Well, I think what we normally do, the most common perspective on the physical and the spiritual today is that we separate them, right? You have your physical over here, and those are things we all have to do in our world, like, move around and go to work, and those are the physical things. And then you have your spiritual category over here, and those are the good things like, praying and worshiping, and you've got those kind of in their place. This is sort of the mentality that we come up with today. The idea of separating the physical and the spiritual bleeds into some of the way that we read the Bible. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus does this thing repeatedly where he says, "You've heard it said to those of old, but I say unto you." He says, "You've heard it said, don't hate your brother." You've heard it said, don't murder your brother. And I'm telling you, don't even hate him. And we often describe this as Jesus taking things from the physical old law to the spiritual new law, as if they're different. I'm going to argue I don't think they're as different as we tend to like to think of them as. They are not as separate as we usually make them. This can turn into a couple of different issues. One of those is compartmentalization of your spirituality. Have you ever known people, maybe you are the people, who go on vacation and they leave everything behind? Like they leave their faith at home because they're on vacation. We don't need to worship. I don't need to bring my Bible with me. I'm on vacation. All right. I remember there was a guy who was talking about a preacher who was retiring, and someone said, "Hey, we ought to get him a new Bible." And he said, "Well, he's retiring. That'd be like getting a construction worker a hammer as a retirement gift." And my thought at the time hearing that was, I don't think you get how this works for a retired preacher. But, you see the idea. Like they're separate. They're compartmentalized. You've got your spiritual and you've got your physical. And they go into their own categories. This is not a new thing, by the way. This is a very, very old thing. All the way back at least in the end of the first century, there was this thing called Gnosticism. We've talked about it a couple of different times. The basic idea was that Jesus couldn't have been fully man and fully God, because if he was fully God, then he couldn't have been physical. And if he was fully man, then he couldn't have been spiritual. That's a massive oversimplification. That's like trying to explain our Democratic Party system by saying you've got liberals and conservatives. It just kind of gets you where you need to go, but there's a lot of study you can do into Gnosticism and all the different sects of that and what they believed. But at its most basic, they had a very specific separation of the physical and the spiritual. This is also something that you can see all the way back in the Old Testament. If you look back in the Old Testament and you do a little bit of study on what the ancient people believed their gods to be, there were gods of places. You have a god of the plains, so we will do battle with you in the plains. Or we have a god of the plains, so we'll do battle there. That's where our God is. But you have a god of the mountains. We're not coming up into the mountains. There was that mindset there. There was also this idea that I would go to the temple to worship the god because that's where he was. And when I left, I was no longer there with him. He was in the temple. I was not in the temple. Therefore, that's where the spiritual was. Now I'm living in the physical. And there was even this idea of being able to take your God with you if you needed to go do something like a journey or a battle, and you'd have your little, guess what it was called? Idol. This is idolatry, to separate the physical and the spiritual like this. I'm afraid that what we do with the physical and the spiritual often looks a little too much like Gnosticism and idolatry. We like to separate them and compartmentalize them. We even ask questions like, how is your spiritual life? Imagine asking Jesus that question, okay? Hey, Jesus, how is your spiritual life? He'd say, what? Because if you have a spiritual life, it implies that part of your life is not spiritual. Was part of Jesus' life not spiritual? I think that question would have confused him. Truthfully, I think it would have confused a lot of people in that day because there was a implicit tie to your life, both physically and spiritually. They were joined together. Now, before we get into the relationship between the physical and the spiritual, I think it's really important that we understand what is spiritual. Again, if I say the word spiritual, you probably have things come into your mind, and that makes sense because all of us have a preconceived idea based on where and when and how we grew up on what that means. Some people hear the word spiritual and they think horror movies, right, with ghosts and spooky things. Some people hear spiritual and they think, well, spiritual is anything that is not physical. They can't even define spiritual without showing that it is not or separate from the physical things, which, again, is very Gnostic. The idea behind one of the things they believed was that Jesus couldn't have been, if he was God, he couldn't have been physical because then he would have had to have human bodily functions, and that can't happen, right? God, spiritual, can't do physical things. That can't happen. Interestingly, they came up with this weird workaround where he must have just been a projection. Hilarious, right? Oh, it's too close to home to be funny, I think. Anyway, so this idea, what is spiritual? You may think of spiritual, or if someone told you, I'm spiritual, you may have a picture in your head. For me, it is a person who is probably vegan somehow and likes to be outside a lot, right? If someone says, I'm spiritual, that might be where your brain goes, okay? Maybe some other fun details with that as well. You may have heard the phrase, I'm spiritual but not religious. You know what that is? That's a person who wants the benefits of spirituality but doesn't want the benefits of God, which is a little confusing. So when we ask this question, what is spiritual? I found that I had a hard time nailing it down. And when I basically was coming up with all these ideas of what spiritual people look like or what people think of when they think about being spiritual, meditation, prayer, I don't know, maybe yoga for some people, probably the vegans. Anyway, so when you ask the question, what is spiritual, obviously a really important thing you need to do is ask, what does the Bible mean when it talks about something that is spiritual? So we're going to look at two places real quick. Look at Galatians chapter 5. Galatians 5, our super fun passage known as the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5, Paul has given a list of things that the Spirit produces, the fruit that the Spirit produces. And as he gets into this list, he lists a couple of things. If you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. He gives a list of the works of the flesh, which are sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. Okay? So those are the works of the flesh, and then he flips there in verse 22 and says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And against such things there is no law. Now, what is spiritual? This is, okay, love and joy and peace and patience and that whole list. Those things are spiritual. Now, if I'm trying to define spiritual, one of the things that I think is helpful is to think of the inverse. And so to say not physical, I think is a helpful answer, but it's not the whole answer. Spiritual things can't be quantified as easily, right? You can't reach out and touch spiritual things. Well, does this list match that? Yeah, absolutely it does. How do you quantify love? Well, you can't really. I mean, you could maybe run some weird tests that figure out how much someone would sell someone out for, but that's not really quantifying love. It's just, quantifying that person and how they feel about money versus another person. So what about joy? Can you give me a measurement of joy? Well, not exactly. Let's branch into some other ones that aren't listed maybe here. What about forgiveness? How do you quantify forgiveness? What about unity? How do you measure? How do you grab? Can I hold unity in my hands? Okay. What about relationship? Can I quantify or show you or hold in my hand or touch or feel a relationship? Like, no. These things are spiritual. Okay, so you've got this list here, and you've got a number of other things that I think would fit in the category of spiritual. Look at Ephesians chapter 6 is another really good place to go to somewhat answer this question. We'll come back to this in a little bit, so we're going to read a bit quickly through it. But in verse 13, Paul is writing, and he says, therefore, take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm. Stand, therefore, having fastened the belt of truth. Okay? How do you quantify truth? That is a difficult thing to put your nose on, right? Like, it's tough you can't really measure truth. Okay, having put on the breastplate of righteousness. Again, how do you hold righteousness in your hand? And shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness of the gospel of peace. Is peace something you can hold? No, it's something you can have, but not the same way that you have a drink in your hand. In all circumstances, verse 16, take up the shield of faith. Once again, we can't quantify faith. With which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Okay, so you've got this list of things that Paul wants you to have as the armor of God. They are spiritual characteristics that Christians are meant to have. So what is spiritual? Well, here's the real kicker. Spiritual are the things that are like God. So if something is a positive spiritual characteristic, it is something that is the characteristic of God. So if you are doing something that is not tangible or quantified, if you are doing something like love, the reason that is a positive spiritual thing is because that's who God is. If you are being truthful, well, the reason that is a positive spiritual characteristic is because that's who God is. If you are forgiving someone when they didn't deserve it, or if they did deserve forgiveness, you are doing that, and it is a positive spiritual thing because that's who God is and what God does. So spirituality, or to be spiritual, is to be striving or to be being like God, to be exhibiting the characteristics of God. Now, and this is something that we do often too, going back to the Gnostics, physical bad, spiritual good. Well, have you read through the Bible? There are some bad spirits in the Bible. There are negative spiritual things in the world. If we're using the same standard, let's ask, things like division. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, let's ask things like anger, things like jealousy, things like hatred. Are these good? These are negative spiritual things. Positive spiritual things are characteristics that are like God. And negative spiritual things, and there are also negative spiritual things that we don't want to emulate. So what is spiritual? Spiritual are the characteristics. To be a spiritual person, typically we're referring to the positive characteristics that are the characteristics of our God. To be loving, to be joyful, to be peaceful, to be patient, to be forgiving, to be unifying, to be in relationship. All of these things are what we're talking about. So the question then becomes, how do we do those spiritual things? Right? If I am going to be spiritual, if that is my goal, is to be spiritual, to exhibit the characteristics of God, if that's what I'm trying to do, how do I do that? How do I make that happen? Physically. Here's what I'm going to say. The spiritual and the physical are inseparable. They're inseparable. They are not meant to be put into their own categories. There are not physical things that are only physical, and there are not spiritual things that are only spiritual. Everything that you do is both physical and spiritual. They are inseparable. So here's a couple of reasons why I think this is the case. The first one is that this is how God works. Okay, this is how our God chooses to work. Romans chapter 1 and verse 20 talks about how God's invisible attributes, it says, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived from the creation of the world. So you can look around, physically look around, and you can see God, who is a spirit. You can see the attributes of God, his eternal power and his divine nature. This is how our God works. All throughout the Bible, God did things physically that had spiritual implications. You think about when he led the people out of Egypt. What did he do? He appeared to them as a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. You think about when the Lord is said to have come and met with people. Typically, he's described as some human-like figure, looking like a human. They talk about all sorts of other things. I had one, and it literally just darted out of my brain. But there are a number of different examples of God doing things physically in the earth, constantly. And then all of that culminates with Jesus. He sent Jesus in the form of a man. He came down to earth in the form of a man and lived a spiritual life physically because they're connected. More than that, though, God even today is working physically and spiritually. Look at Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 6. Ephesians 4 and verse 6, Paul's just wrapped up his really, really beautiful passage about the 7 ones. And he gets to this last one here in verse 6 and says that there is one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But God is spiritual. We're physical. He can't be over and through and in. Unless Paul's wrong, right? God is over all and through all and in all. Look at how Paul describes it in Acts chapter 17. Flip back to Acts 17. He's teaching these people in Athens. This is the passage that there's the altar to the unknown God, and he starts telling them, I'm going to tell you about this God. And as he's going through and discussing who this God is, talking about the one true God, he describes God as verse 27 says that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each of us. For, and here he's referencing something, in him we live and move and have our being. Paul's talking about physical people in a physical world and describes them as being in God, living in him and moving in him and being in him. To be alive now is to be in God, who is spirit, but here physically as well. Somehow, these two are not meant to be separated. God is all over the place. We're able to see his invisible attributes. Paul describes him as being the Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And Paul describes him again as being the person or the being that we live in and move in, and the being who gives us our very being. Now, this makes a lot more sense when you think back on Genesis chapter 1. Flip all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. Look at Genesis 1. Not only does God work in the physical as the spiritual, not only are they combined in the way that God works, but they're also meant to be together in the way that we were made. So, after God creates the entire world, he gets to humans. And let's look at that's chapter 4. Look at verse 6. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 6. It says, "A mist was going up from the land and watering the whole face of the ground. And when the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground." Okay, so God took man from what? The earth. The physical, dirtiest part of the earth. The dust of the ground, right? It doesn't get more earthy and physical than dirt. Okay? Formed man from the dirt, and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Now, we've talked about this before, but in Hebrew, there is one word that means wind and breath and spirit. They're all the same exact word. And so, this could also read, breathed into his nostrils the spirit of life, which is pretty unique to humans in creation. It sounds a lot like God created them in his own image. And so you've got this creation of humans. How we were created was from the physical with the spiritual in us at the same time, both together. They're not meant to be separated. So not only is this how God works, but secondly, this is how we were made. And thirdly, this is how we are meant to work. Okay, this is how we are meant to work. We talked about if the spiritual are love and joy and forgiveness and kindness, if that's what it is, if that's what spiritual is, are the characteristics of God, then how do we do that? What are we supposed to do? We can't do it without physically doing it. Look at Matthew chapter 25. And we have time to read it. Matthew chapter 25, verse 31. Jesus is describing the end of days, the final judgment. And he describes it in verse 31. He says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.'" Time out. So he just listed a whole bunch of pretty boring physical acts, did he not? You see someone who has a physical need, and you meet their physical need? That was the criteria here. Why are you coming in and being blessed and being in inheritance and in that? Because you took care of people physically, okay? Then the righteous are going to answer and say, verse 37, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." So hold on. You're telling me, to be spiritual would be to try and be like God. And certainly doing something for God is a spiritual act, right? He just equated doing things physically for people with doing things spiritually for God. They're inseparable. You can't do something physically that doesn't have an impact spiritually. You can't do something spiritually. It doesn't impact physically. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then he continues, verse 41. He'll say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For when I was hungry, you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. I was naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they will also answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. I think because of how we like to separate the physical and the spiritual, we think sometimes that if I live a spiritual life, or if I do all the right things spiritually, I'll go to heaven. Sing, go to church, read my Bible, pray every day. Jesus says if you are not doing the right thing physically, that matters. All right? And so you've got this standard set by Jesus about eternity, and he's saying straight up, the physical and the spiritual are together. Because whenever you do something physically for one of the least of these, you are doing it spiritually for me, your God. That's pretty significant. So how do you do these things, right? How do you show love? Physically, you do things for other people. You do things to show that you are loving them. You can't love someone in word only. How do you show forgiveness? Well, it's going to probably have to be more than mental assent to forgiveness. It's going to probably be physically illustrating the fact that I'm willing to trust you again, or I'm willing to be kind to you now, or I'm willing to bring you into my home even though you've wronged me. Or, like Jean Valjean and the priest in Les Mis, I'm willing to lie to the police officers so that you can go free and forgive you for stealing from me. I'm willing to do something to forgive you. How do you show unity? Well, you don't just say, yeah, we're good. You show it. You be with these people. You spend time with, you talk with, you engage with, you have them in your home. How do you show joy? Well, you don't just say, I'm joyful, and then frown every time you walk out of the building. You smile. That's how you show joy. How do you bring other people joy? Well, I don't know. You may do it differently than me. I like to make people laugh personally, but other people might do it with hugs. Other people might do it with kind words or compliments. How do you show these things? Physically. How do you show love to someone in need? You meet their physical need. And therefore, are spiritually meeting their need as well of love. So, the physical and the spiritual are inseparable. This is, I think, abundantly clear throughout the Bible. There are a number of different, honestly, this was one of those lessons that I probably had to pull 2 or 3 thirds. How many thirds are there? 3? 2 or 3 thirds out of this lesson to make it fit in the time length. Like, there is so much in our book that shows and highlights that the physical and the spiritual are meant to be together, not separate, that they are inseparable from one another. But we've looked at some of it tonight, and we need to leave with a so what. What does this matter? If, in fact, the physical and the spiritual are entirely inseparable, if everything physical and spiritual are meant to be together, then what does that mean for us? Okay, we got 3 of them. First one, everything you do physically affects you spiritually, and vice versa. Everything you do spiritually affects you physically. Let's deal with this first one. I don't know how long it's been since you've been to a abstinence seminar for teenagers, okay? But this is one of the areas that we understand this the best, all right? When it comes to sex and sexuality, we tell kids all the time, you can't do it without having repercussions, right? Like, for years and years and years and years, people have said it's just a physical act. It's just No, it's not. Repeatedly, people are finding out, no, it is not. There is a spiritual component to having a sexual relationship, no matter what level. There is a connection. That's how God made it, because the spiritual and the physical are not meant to be separate. And we get that when it comes to sex, but for some reason we don't get that when it comes to other things. We don't get it when it comes to drinking. Right? We don't get it when it comes to a number of different examples of ways in which what you do physically affects you spiritually. We still think I can physically do whatever I want to do and spiritually do all the right things and I'm good. When in actuality, what you do physically affects you spiritually. And the inverse. We talked about this, I think it was 2 weeks ago. Listen, they are actually discovering that prayer and singing impact your physical health. People who pray live longer. That is a scientific fact. You're telling me what you do spiritually impacts you physically? Yes, because they are not meant to be separated, which means every single thing that you do will impact you spiritually. Everything you do will impact your soul. Every physical act that you partake in has an impact. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. 1 Peter 2 and verse 11, Peter says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." What's Peter saying here? Well, he's not just saying, hey, don't desire these things. He's saying, stay away from doing these things. These passions, don't go do these physical passions of the flesh. Right? Don't get wrapped up in them. Why? It's just physical. Doesn't matter. No, because what you do physically impacts you spiritually. It will wage war against your soul. That's what Peter says. Everything you do physically affects you spiritually and vice versa. Number 2, the everyday, mundane, physical things that we do are or can be an act of spiritual warfare. Look at Ephesians chapter 6. Let's bounce back over there. Ephesians chapter 6. It has been a while now. I think like 3 years since we studied the book of Ephesians together, since I taught the book of Ephesians, I should say. Ephesians chapter 6 is one of those passages that I don't know, when you just read it, could make you uncomfortable if you have the physical and the spiritual separated. Look at verse 10. He says, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." Okay? So these are the devil's schemes. Verse 12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." That is some grand language, is it not? I mean, that is intense, okay? So what we are fighting against as Christians are spiritual forces. Remember, we said there are negative spiritual forces. My argument here is if the positive spiritual forces, the solutions to these problems, like we've read, are the belt of truth and righteousness and peace and faith, if these are the solutions to the problem, then the issues would be faithlessness and I don't know what the opposite of righteousness is. Wrongjousness, all right? Chaos instead of peace. It would be lies and deceit instead of truth. And so if we just take this passage and just listen to it, just listen to what it says, it's telling us that we, Christians, are in a spiritual battle daily with spiritual forces of evil who are being enacted by the devil. Okay? That's what it says. Now, these spiritual evil, these evil spiritual forces can be a number of different things. They don't typically look like what that conjures up in our mind. I don't know about you, but when I read that initially, I think, I don't know, demon possession or something crazy like that, right? It doesn't seem like that's what Paul's talking about, because the solution to demon possession is not the metaphorical belt of truth, right? We saw what they did with demon possession in the first century. They cast out demons in the name of Jesus. Paul's solution to what he's talking about here are spiritual attributes of God, like truth and peace and faithfulness and righteousness. And so we are in a spiritual battle that is meant to be fought with our everyday physical activities. Because telling the truth is a physical activity. Learning the truth is a physical activity. Being peaceful is something that you can do physically. You can't be peaceful and have nobody know it, right? Like you've got these acts of spiritual warfare coming against us, division, jealousy, disunity, okay? You've got hatred, you've got deception, and the solution to this is the opposite, the spiritual characteristics of God. Truth, faithfulness. Let's go back to the fruit of the Spirit. Love and joy and peace and patience. How about forgiveness or relationship? How about peace and truth? Just like we're reading in Ephesians. The everyday, mundane, physical things that we do are, or at least can be, an act of spiritual warfare. What I mean is this. Let me tell you a story about a guy named Kelly Woodcock. So a lot of you know Kelly, and him and his family have been here several different times. Kelly is, I don't know how much older Kelly is than me. Kelly is enough older than me that I was not in middle school by the time he left for college. So at least 7, 8, 9 years older than me. Significantly older, which is a much larger gap the younger you are. You know what I'm saying? Like when you're 49 and 39, that's, you're basically both adults. But when you are 19 and 9 years old, that's an enormous gap. You are basically two different types of people entirely, right? And so when I was very young, probably 8 or 9 or 10, and Kelly was 18, 19, 20 in there, somewhere in there, about 10 years, he was the nicest human to me I have ever known, all right? Listen, he didn't do much of anything, to be honest with you. Here's what Kelly did. When I was very young, Kelly treated me like a person. He would see me, he'd say, "Hey, bud, how you doing?" Put out his hand. You can hear it, right? He'd put out his hand. He'd shake my hand. I'd shake his hand. He'd say, "How are things going?" I'd say, "Good." He'd say, "Are you still playing basketball?" I'd say, "Yeah, I made the whatever team." And he'd say, "Oh, man, that's awesome. I'm so glad for you." And then he'd move on to the next person. That was it. I'm telling you right now, that has made an impact on me to this day. That treatment of me as a child by Kelly has impacted the way that I treat children dramatically. I do my best to treat kids the way Kelly treated me, because you know what it made me feel like when I was little? Like I was the coolest person in the world, because Kelly was the coolest person in the world. That's really what it was. It's not only impacted me and how I treat children, but it's also impacted the way that I teach other people to treat children. One of my kids in Durant's name was Caleb Gobert. He was a very normal teenager who didn't have a lot of patience for younger kids because younger kids are annoying. We know it. It's okay. We were all that once. No hate, all right? And I told Caleb, I said, "Listen, man, you don't know this, but let me tell you about a guy named Kelly. Here's the impact that he made on me, and it doesn't take a lot from you. Just look them in the eye, ask them how they're doing, treat them with kindness, and treat them like they're people, because they are people. They might be annoying people, but they're just people, all right?" Listen, there is a tendency for adults to treat kids as less than people. It's like our natural default, because they are kids and they don't understand the world and they don't have things that matter. Things that matter to them are their new Pokemon cards, and that does not actually matter, right? Like there's a tendency to in a sense, this might be dramatic language, but in a sense, dehumanize little kids because they are not adults and they are not as important, right? Now, Kelly did exactly the opposite of that. He brought value into my life. He gave kindness to me freely, expecting nothing in return. And as a result of that, there are going to be anyone that I interact with who is going to be taught those exact same spiritual lessons that are going to be done through the physical act of being kind to children. Can you guys think of a story in the Bible somewhere where Jesus said something about how you treat children? Do you remember a time when the disciples said, "Hey, they are not as important as adults. They might be less important to your life, and so don't bother with them." And Jesus called one of them over and said, "Hey, if one of you can't become like one of these, you're not entering into the kingdom of heaven." See, the everyday, mundane, physical things that we do can be an act of spiritual warfare. Telling the truth is battling deception. Showing love is confronting hate. Being forgiving is confronting hatefulness? I lost it. What's the opposite of forgiving? Resentment, right? Choosing forgiveness is confronting or pushing back against resentfulness. When you think of any of these fruits of the Spirit, joy is flying in the face of sadness, right? You've got peace is battling against chaos. All of these things that we do on a regular basis in our day-to-day life that seem boring and simple and useless and physical are spiritual. And they can be acts of spiritual warfare against the schemes of the devil and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. That's what Paul tells us. The spiritual and the physical are not meant to be separate, and if they are together, like they're meant to be, then everything we do physically affects us spiritually and vice versa. The everyday, mundane, physical things that we do can be an act of spiritual warfare. And lastly, as I was thinking about this, I don't know, I should have written more down because I had a lot of thoughts and feelings, but I have written number 3, missed opportunities. That's all I have written down. When I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how deeply connected the physical and the spiritual are, and how for so long in my brain, I'm sure like many others, I tried to separate out the physical from the spiritual. I just thought about all the times that I was doing something physically, and God was right there with me, and I didn't see him. I didn't think about him. And all I could think was the feeling that came over me, I would describe as what the movies describe as when someone dies before they were supposed to, and that feeling of, I wish I could just have one more conversation, or I wish I would have called them more. I sat there and I thought, why wouldn't I, if he's right here all the time in every decision that I make, and everything I'm doing physically is affecting me spiritually, and I'm waging warfare against the spiritual forces of evil, and I'm trying to be more like God every day with the physical acts that I'm doing and demonstrate the spiritual attributes of our God, and he's right here with me. Why haven't I talked to him more? Why didn't I ask him for help in more of those situations? Like how many times has he been right here with me, and I haven't even been thinking about him? If everything we do is physical and spiritual together, well, Acts chapter 17, Paul says that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us. He's above all and through all and in all. God is right here with us in this dirty, disgusting physical world that we keep messing up, and he's right here with us. Above all and through all and in all. The physical and the spiritual were both made by God. We were made to have both of those together, not to separate them. And this should impact every single part of our life, physically and spiritually, or are they the same thing? If we understand how God made us, and we understand who our God is, it should impact every second of every day. And we should hear the echo of an invitation of a God who is not a long way off waiting for us to make it to him through spiritual meditation and prayer and all the spiritual activities, but a God who is right here with us, next to us, and in us, who wants us to be with him and choose him through every single activity, every single physical choice that we make every day. And that's the invitation of our God. I'm here with you. Open your eyes. I made this for you. Live like you want me to, because I'm right here with you. and I want you to be with me. That's the invitation that has always been extended.